In the 18th year of his reign, King Josiah ordered the temple to be repaired. What began as a restoration of stones turned into a rediscovery of words. A forgotten scroll was found in the house of the Lord, the book of the law of the Lord. When it was read aloud to the king, it tore open the silence of history. Josiah tore his garments. The prophetess Huldah was consulted, and from that moment, the entire narrative of Judah shifted. It was no longer merely a story of reforms or religious zeal. It became a story of confrontation between divine speech and a covenant-breaking people. 2 Kings 22, verse 16 stands at the apex of that turning. It is the verse where divine revelation, once buried and unread, becomes judicially active. The scroll has been found. Its words have been read. And now, God speaks again, not through Moses, but through Huldah. What he says in this verse is not just an oracle. It is a convergence of voice, agency, judgment, memory, and responsibility. To fully understand the force of this verse, we must go deeper than the translation. We must look into the structure of the language itself, how meaning is not just delivered in words, but encoded in their relationships. What emerges from this close reading is a sequence of 5 triads, 3-word clusters that each reveal a distinct moment in the descent of divine communication from heaven to earth, from mystery to history. This approach does not reduce the text to cold logic. It reveals the living logic of Scripture itself. The 5 triads form a cascade, a theological descent from divine speech into human history, where every phrase is a hinge between worlds. And so, we begin not with disaster, nor with the king, nor even with the scroll, but with the form of the utterance itself, amar Adonai. When God speaks, how do we know it? What is required for that speech to carry the authority of heaven? Let us now step into that first triad, and listen closely, not only to what is said, but to how speech itself becomes revelation. The simple phrase amar Adonai, thus has said the Lord, appears so often in the Hebrew Bible that it can almost become invisible. But if we pause to listen closely, we discover a profound architecture of communication, a sacred geometry of revelation. We begin with a small word meaning thus. On its own, it does not bear meaning. It doesn't declare anything yet. Instead, it functions like a formal signal or a framing device. It tells the listener, what you are about to hear is not ordinary speech. It prepares the audience to receive something with weight, structure, and origin. It is the prophetic equivalent of the curtain rising in a courtroom just before the judge speaks. Then comes amar, the verb meaning he said or has said. But this isn't just reporting speech. It's affirming that speech has already been delivered from a specific source. The perfect tense carries the sense that the utterance is fixed, completed, stable. It's not emerging in the moment. It is being transmitted as something already spoken from beyond. And finally, we have Adonai, the reverent stand-in for the Tetragrammaton, the sacred name of God. This is the name given to Moses at the burning bush, the name that carries both covenant and eternity. It is not a generic title like God or Lord. It is the name, anchoring the utterance in the specific identity of Israel's covenantal God. Now, tradition treats this formula, amar Adonai, as the hallmark of prophecy. It's not a stylistic flourish, it's a legal, theological, and liturgical boundary. According to rabbinic and later commentators, a prophet who speaks without invoking this structure risks stepping outside the prophetic office. The phrase signals that what follows is not invention or intuition, but divine communication with covenantal consequence. This brings us to the logic that best explains this triad, which we might call conjoined structure. Each term on its own is insufficient. If someone merely says amar, he said, we are left wondering, who said it, and on what authority? If we have only thus, we are left with form but no content. And even if we name Adonai without the other elements, we are not necessarily invoking an act of speech. It is only when all three, amar Adonai, come together that prophecy, in its full sense, takes form. The frame, the verb, and the speaker operate as one unit. Without any one of them, the whole collapses. But this triad doesn't just hang together by necessity, it also sings. When we look at it through the lens of harmonic logic, we see that the utterance, amar, is not just the result of adding form to source. It is the emergent fusion of the two. The prophet is not just passing along information, the prophet is manifesting God's presence in communicable form. In this way, the prophetic utterance becomes a kind of incarnation, not of God's body but of God's will, shaped in words, emerging from the union of divine identity and structured address. And yet, if we push further, we see that this harmony is also delicate. The third interpretive pattern, which we might call integration, shows how easily the whole prophetic act can break down. Without the speech may be divine in source, but it lacks the form that allows a human audience to recognize it as prophecy. Without Adonai, the form may be imitated, but it becomes false. Merely the appearance of prophecy. The integration must be complete. Prophecy, as a communicative event, is not just about saying true things. It is about structured truth emerging from a known source within a recognized frame. This is why, in the biblical tradition, a prophet must be tested. Does their speech begin with amar Adonai? Are they invoking the divine name responsibly? Are they following the form? And is their speech consistent with the covenant already revealed? These questions are not just bureaucratic. They guard the boundary between divine word and human presumption. But this triad, and the logic it reveals, reaches beyond the realm of prophecy. It teaches us something universal, that authority in speech requires both origin and structure. Think of a courtroom. If a verdict is pronounced without legal procedure, KO, or without jurisdiction, Adonai, it doesn't matter how compelling the content is, the speech is invalid. Think of a teacher, a leader, or a writer. We recognize their words as weighty, not just because of what they say, but because of who says them and how they are framed. So the question this triad leaves us with is both practical and spiritual. When we speak, do we speak from truth? Do we frame our words with care? Do we source them from something higher than self-interest or emotion? And when we hear others speak, do we listen for the whole structure? For integrity, for grounding, for the proper frame? In the prophetic imagination, speech is never neutral. Every utterance either reveals or conceals. And in this triad, we are shown how God chooses to be revealed. Not through raw power, but through carefully formed, intentionally framed, relationally grounded words. Let us now turn to Hineni Mevi Ra'ah, behold I am bringing evil. A phrase that marks a turning point, not merely in divine speech, but in divine action. This is the moment in the passage where the prophetic utterance crosses the threshold from declaration into enactment. What was once announced is now moving into history, and the tone shifts accordingly. Here, the God who speaks becomes the God who acts, with presence, power, and terrifying precision. The triad opens with Hineni, often translated as behold I, but far more evocative than that bare rendering suggests. In biblical usage, Hineni is a word of profound availability. It is spoken by prophets who stand ready to serve, Abraham, Moses, Samuel, yet here, it is God himself who utters it. When God says Hineni, he does not merely say, I am here. He is stepping forward, placing himself into the scene, declaring his full and active presence. No longer distant or delayed, God is now the subject, not only of speech, but of history. From there, we move to Mevi, and bringing. The verb here is a participle, suggesting not just a momentary act but an ongoing process. God is not only deciding to act, he is already in the act. The motion has begun. The machinery of judgment has been set in motion, and it is being carried forward by the personal agency introduced in Hineni. There is a theological immediacy here. The God who was invoked in speech is now present in history. And what is God bringing? The third term, Ra'ah, leaves no ambiguity, evil, or more accurately, calamity. In this context, Ra'ah does not refer to moral evil, but to disaster, judgment, ruin. It is covenantal punishment, in direct fulfillment of the curses outlined in the book of Deuteronomy. This is the moment where divine patience reaches its limit and transforms into divine consequence. The voice that once warned now acts. Traditionally, commentators recognize this verse as the precise point where God's warning becomes his intervention. The prophetic word has been spoken, the book of the covenant has been read, and now God steps into the narrative with agency. There is no more delay. Hulda's prophecy does not issue a call to repent, because the decree is already unfolding. Hineni mevi ra'ah is thus a phrase of finality. Now, how do we understand the structure of this triad? The clearest logic that undergirds it is causal. The divine presence, hineni, triggers divine action, mevi, which produces divine judgment, ra'ah. It is a forward-moving sequence in which the presence of God is not neutral or passive. It causes things, and those things are not arbitrary. They are consequences, real, embodied, and severe. But this triad does more than trace cause and effect. When we step into deeper patterns, we see that the relationship here is not only linear, it is also reinforcing. In the structure of reinforcement, action and consequence do not simply follow one another, they intensify and reflect backward. God's presence doesn't just lead to calamity. Calamity, once visible, reveals the nature of that divine presence. What kind of God is this, who says hineni and brings judgment? The calamity becomes a mirror. It reflects something back to the people about who Yahweh is. This is a God who is not absent, who is not silent, and who does not indefinitely defer justice. The judgment itself becomes a revelation. In this sense, Ra'ah is not only a consequence, it is a revelation. And the people who witness it must ask themselves, what does this calamity tell us about God? That question is embedded in the very structure of the triad. And yet another layer emerges when we look at the non-linear logic of this triad. In this pattern, the elements do not proceed in a simple straight line, but loop and interlace. Here, Ra'ah, the calamity, is already implied in the presence of God. When hineni is spoken by Yahweh in the context of judgment, it is not a neutral declaration. It already contains within it the seed of disaster. The disaster is not just a result of God's action, it is encoded in his appearance. Once God steps forward in this mode, the outcome is sealed. This gives the triad a chilling inevitability. It warns us, when God comes not in mercy but in judgment, he does not arrive as a negotiator, he arrives as judge. The very act of showing up already includes the sentence. In such a context, neutrality is impossible. There is no safe place to stand once hineni has been spoken. So what do we learn, more broadly, from this triad? First, that divine presence is not always comforting. We often long for God to show himself. But in this verse, we are reminded that when God appears in judgment, it is no longer time to talk, it is time to reckon. This is the terrifying side of divine faithfulness, not only that God keeps his promises, but that he keeps his warnings. Second, we see that actions do not exist in isolation. They reveal character. Just as the disaster reveals the presence that caused it, our own actions, in reflection, reveal who we are. What we bring into the world, whether healing or harm, becomes part of our revealed nature. And finally, this triad presses upon us a question of response. What do we do when calamity begins to unfold? Do we see it as random? Or do we read it as communication? As the unfolding echo of a word already spoken? A presence already declared? In hineni mevi ra'ah, God has entered the scene. And when God enters, nothing remains static. Let us now consider el hamakom hazeh ve'al yoshvav, upon this place, and upon its inhabitants. If the earlier triads announce the speaker and the act of judgment, this one reveals the target. The words now shift our attention from divine voice and divine agency to the realm of human consequence, where judgment lands and whom it touches. The phrase begins with el hamakom, upon the place. The term makom in Hebrew carries more than geographical significance. In the Hebrew Bible, makom is often a theological term. It denotes not just space, but designated space, space that bears divine relevance. It is used for sacred sites, for altars, for encounters with God. Here it refers to Jerusalem, but it carries the resonance of something more. It is the place of covenant, of temple, of promise. This is the spiritual heart of Judah. Then comes Hazeh. This. It is a small word, but it is sharpened by its proximity to Makom. Together, Hamakom Hazeh does not just mean this place in a neutral sense. It means this place, the one under direct divine scrutiny. The demonstrative particle zeh localizes the judgment. It is not theoretical, it is immediate. There is a finger pointing here. This city, this ground, these walls. But the judgment does not stop at soil and stones. It continues with Ve'al Yoshvav and upon its inhabitants. The scope widens from territory to community. The land is not judged in isolation, nor are the people separable from the place they dwell. Together, they form a single covenantal unit, land and people, bound together under the same verdict. Traditional commentators have long recognized the theological precision of this pairing. In the Torah, the land and the people are deeply intertwined. The land responds to human behavior. When Israel obeys, the land yields fruit. When Israel rebels, the land becomes desolate. In Leviticus and Deuteronomy, God warns that the land itself will vomit out its inhabitants if they break the covenant. Here in 2 Kings, that dynamic is coming to a head. The disaster God is bringing is not just upon individuals, nor is it merely environmental. It is total. The logic that structures this triad is one of coexistence. Each element gains its full meaning only through its connection to the others. The place is not neutral space. It is sacred because of its people. The people are not just a population. They are Judah, the covenant community, because they dwell in this place. Remove either land or people, and the meaning of the other unravels. Together they define the context for judgment. But the logic deepens when we explore additional interpretive patterns. One such pattern is what we might call a bottlenecked structure. In this view, the identity of this place, Hazeh, relies entirely on the conjunction of its physical geography, Makom, and its community, Yoshvav. If both land and people are absent, Hazeh ceases to have content. The place is not this place without its theological and communal anchors. This explains something deeply important for exilic theology. After the destruction of Jerusalem, what happens to Makom Hazeh? Without the people, the sacred geography loses its frame. Even the demonstrative, this becomes hollow. This leads us to a sobering but profound theological insight. Place is not just physical, it is relational. It becomes what it is through divine designation and human habitation. When God brings judgment on the place and its inhabitants, he is not simply punishing, they are being unmade as a covenantal whole. The destruction is not only material, it is ontological. It dissolves a structure that once carried divine presence. And yet, when we look at this triad through the lens of harmonic logic, we find something else emerging. Something constructive, even amid destruction. In the harmonic view, identity arises from convergence. The people, Yoshvav, derive their meaning from dwelling in Makom, and the place gains its meaning from being inhabited by a covenant people. This mutual shaping suggests that even in judgment, what is being torn down is something that was once beautifully formed. The triad is not only about what is being judged, it is about what once existed. A holy harmony of God, land, and people. This raises a haunting question. What happens when that harmony is broken? What does it mean when the land is no longer inhabited by those who bear the covenant? When sacred space is emptied of sacred purpose? And for us, beyond the bounds of ancient Judah, what defines our sacred places? Is it geography, or the lives we live within them? Can a land still be holy if its people forget their calling? The lesson here is layered. On one level, we see that God's judgment is specific, not abstract. It comes upon this place and these people, not just in some generic sense, but in concrete, recognizable terms. But deeper still, we are shown that identity, whether personal, communal, or national, is built in relationships. Between land and people, between dwelling and responsibility, between covenant and consequence. This triad is the turning of the knife. The divine judgment will not fall randomly, but precisely where it must. Because the people and the place have ceased to function in harmony, the entire structure must be dismantled. The covenant was not merely words, it was a lived reality, bound to soil and society. And now, it will be unbound. Now we arrive at Kol Divrei Hasefer Asher, all the words of the book which, a triad that pivots from judgment to justification. Here the prophet no longer merely announces what will happen or to whom, it now reveals why. The judgment does not fall like lightning from the sky, arbitrary and unexplained. It is grounded, it is sourced, and that source is not hidden in mystery, but inscribed in a book. We begin with Kol Divrei, all the words. This opening phrase stresses comprehensiveness. Not some of the words, not a summary or paraphrase, all of them. In biblical Hebrew, divrei is not simply words in the modern minimal sense. It includes utterances, decrees, events. When linked with kol, the phrase becomes totalizing. Every instruction, every warning, every consequence spoken by God is now brought into view. There is no escape through partial reading or selective memory. The judgment being executed comes in full alignment with the full revelation. Then we are told that these words belong to Hasefer. The book. Not just a book, but the book, the definite article pointing us back to the scroll found earlier in the chapter during Josiah's temple reforms. Most scholars and traditional commentators identify this book as a portion of Deuteronomy, especially the covenant curses of chapters 28-30. The book becomes the anchor of accountability. It is no longer dormant, it is now activated. What was read by the king becomes the very terms of the judgment now falling upon the people. And finally we encounter the relative particle asher, which. On the surface, this may seem like a grammatical bridge, but structurally it is much more. Asher introduces the next clause in the verse, linking the scroll's content to its human audience. It does not allow the book to remain an object on a shelf. It ties the text to its readers, and by extension, to their responsibilities. Asher is the hinge by which the written word becomes active history. In traditional exegesis, this triad is essential. It reminds us that the people are not being judged without warning. The law had already laid out what would happen if they broke covenant. The words were there, written, preserved, waiting. And now, the scroll has been rediscovered and read aloud by King Josiah. There is no longer ignorance and no longer delay. The triad forms a transition, from latent obligation to activated judgment. Logically, the structure here is best understood through the lens of nonlinear causation. The scroll, Hasefer, does not act directly. Rather, the words, Kol Divrei, provide the force of judgment, but only when they are read, received, and linked to human engagement. It is not the object, the scroll, that carries power in itself, but the full content within it. The words give the book its weight, and through Asher, those words become binding once they intersect with human action. Judgment does not emerge in a straight line, it spirals outward from reading, recognition, and response. But more than just cause and effect, this triad opens into a pattern we might call inclusive logic. In this view, the comprehensive nature of the words leads to the recognition of the book's divine authority, which then leads to the application of that authority to a human situation. Once applied, the book's authority is confirmed. In other words, the cycle completes itself. The words validate the book shapes the people, and the people's engagement seals the words. This is a pattern of canonization, not in the sense of creating new scripture, but in recognizing the authority of what was already given. This is why, in the narrative of Josiah's reform, everything hinges on the reading of the scroll. The moment the king hears it, rips his garments, and consults the prophetess, the book ceases to be dormant. It becomes active. It is not only descriptive, it is judicial. This logic reflects a deep biblical principle. Revelation is not fulfilled until it is received. The scroll had always been true, but now it becomes operative. The third layer of logic here involves integration. For the book to function as judgment, two things must occur. Its words must be full, kol divrei, and those words must intersect with real human experience, asher. If only fragments of the book are read, or if the people never connect the scroll to their lives, then it remains inert. This is why the rediscovery of the scroll in the temple was not a literary event. It was an existential collision. The words met the people, and the result was crisis. This pattern speaks powerfully to the nature of truth and its reception. A book, no matter how sacred, has no force until it is heard, until it is read aloud, until it meets a human life and demands a response. This triad teaches us that truth is relational. It must be full, it must be grounded, and it must be engaged. And once those conditions are met, the book is no longer a scroll. It becomes a sword, a mirror, a verdict. So the question becomes, what are we doing with the texts that sit before us? Are they static to us? Are they memory, or living judgment? Have we read the fullness of the words, or just a part? And once we read them, do we stop at understanding, or do we let them press into action? The triad kol divrei hasefer asher is quiet but devastating. It does not describe God's anger or power directly. Instead, it shows us that the judgment comes not from heaven alone, but from earth's own recognition of a covenant broken, a word ignored, a book now read. This is not arbitrary punishment. This is truth returning to claim its due. Finally, we come to Kara Melech Yehuda, read the King of Judah. In this final movement of the verse, the theological and logical tension tightens. The divine voice has spoken, the judgment has been announced, its target has been specified, and the legal basis has been established. What remains is the crucial human link, the moment when divine revelation is heard and acknowledged by the figure responsible to act upon it. This triad turns our attention to the person of the king, and with him, the nation he represents. The first word, kara, means read. This is more than mere literacy. In the biblical imagination, reading is an act of covenantal encounter. The king's reading is public, not private. It is liturgical, judicial, communal. He is not reading for information. He is reading in order to bring the words of the scroll into contact with the life of the people. The scroll has been found, opened, and now declared aloud. In that act, the words of the book become the standard of judgment. Next comes Melech, king. This figure is not just any reader. He is Judah's anointed, the political and spiritual leader whose identity is bound to Torah observance. According to Deuteronomy 17, the king is to write a copy of the law and read from it all his days, so that he may fear God and lead righteously. When Josiah reads the scroll, he is fulfilling that mandate. But by doing so, he is also accepting a profound responsibility. What the king reads, the kingdom is bound to. And then we have Yehuda, Judah, the southern kingdom, the remnant of David's line, the people still dwelling in the land after the northern tribes had been scattered. Here, Yehuda is not just a geopolitical unit. It is a covenantal identity. And the use of the name in this triad signals that the judgment is not isolated to the king alone. His reading implicates the nation. His response becomes their mirror. Traditionally, this moment is seen as the climax of accountability. When Josiah reads the scroll, he rends his garments in grief. That gesture is not theatrical. It is theological. It expresses the full realization that the covenant has been broken, that the people stand condemned by the very words God had given them. And because the king reads, the nation cannot claim ignorance. The verdict has been made audible, visible, inescapable. This triad moves along the logic of inclusive causation. The king reads the scroll, which brings the people into the orbit of divine judgment. And yet, once the people are implicated, the reading itself becomes retroactively confirmed as an act of leadership and responsibility. The inclusion runs in both directions. The reading draws the people into judgment, and their implication seals the significance of the king's act. But this dynamic can also be understood through the lens of causal activation. If Josiah had not read the scroll, the judgment might still have been suspended. The book could have remained hidden, the covenant could have lain dormant. But once the scroll is read, the legal machinery begins to turn. The words already written are now heard, and the hearing brings the nation into crisis. The act of reading is not neutral. It is the trigger. And yet, there is a darker symmetry when we reflect on the pattern of feedback. In this model, we see that if Judah were not a covenantal people, Yehuda, then Josiah's kingship, Melech, would be hollow. A king is not a king in the abstract. He is king over a people. If there were no people, there would be no one to read on behalf of, and if there were no king, the scroll would remain a personal relic, not a national pronouncement. The roles feed back into one another. The king shapes the people, but the people also give the king his meaning. Their shared identity generates the conditions for responsibility and consequence alike. This creates a sobering theological insight. Representation is irreversible. Josiah may be righteous, and God may honor his humility with a personal reprieve, but the system he inhabits does not allow him to undo the sins of generations past. His leadership is bound to a people, and his reading of the scroll confirms that connection. He cannot repent alone, nor can he shield the nation from the judgment that has now been awakened. And so we return to the essential question: what happens when authority meets revelation? The king, reading the scroll, becomes the catalyst. His voice animates the dormant text. His act draws a line between ignorance and responsibility. From that moment on, Judah is no longer a passive subject of divine history. It becomes accountable, not merely for what it has done, but for what it now knows. This triad leaves us with a final, pressing lesson. Revelation demands response. Authority must act on what it knows. And those in leadership, whether kings, teachers, parents, or civic figures, bear the weight of their hearing on behalf of others. To read is not just to understand, it is to bind. To invoke the word is to invite the consequence. With Kara Melech Yehuda, the circle closes. The divine speech has moved from heaven to book to king to people. And from there it will move into history. The words will become events. And the only question remaining is, who will listen? And what will they do with what they've heard? Now that we've examined each triad individually, we are ready to see how they cohere into a unified narrative. Not just a sequence of phrases, but a theological cascade, an unfolding revelation whose structure mirrors the gravity of its content. The first triad, amar Adonai, opens the scene with clarity and authority. It is the genre stamp of prophecy, the form in which God's speech becomes intelligible in history. Here, the divine will enter the world not as raw power, but as structured communication. It teaches us that revelation, if it is to be known, must be framed and grounded: form, ko, action, amar, and identity, Adonai, working together in sacred unity. Without this opening moment, nothing that follows can be heard as divine. It is not just what is said that matters, but how and by whom it is said. From there, in the second triad, Hineni Mevi Ra'ah, the voice steps into the world of consequence. God declares, "Here I am, not in mercy, but in judgment." His presence is no longer hidden behind the veil of speech. It is advancing, bringing disaster. The momentum here is terrifying. The reading of the scroll has activated a response from God, and his arrival already carries calamity within it. The logic of inevitability sets in. Judgment is not potential, it is in motion. This triad teaches us that presence is not always comfort, and that the God who speaks will also act. Then the third triad shifts focus. El Hamakom Hazeh Ve'al Yoshvav. The target of judgment is no longer abstract. The lens narrows to this place and its inhabitants. Sacred geography and sacred people are bound together, and now, judged together. There is no separation between land and life. The triad reminds us that identity is never just personal or individual. It is relational, spatial, and communal. When the land suffers, it is because the people have failed. When the people are judged, it is because they have broken the covenant that also sanctifies their place. But what justifies such judgment? That answer lies in the fourth triad, Kol Divrei HaSefer Asher. The judgment is not arbitrary. It flows from all the words of the book. A scroll rediscovered, a covenant re-encountered. The scroll is no longer dormant. Its words, once ignored, have now returned to the center of the national story. But the book does not act on its own. It becomes a judicial instrument only when it intersects with human action. The triad teaches us that truth must be received, not just written. The book is not just a relic. It is a living covenant. When its words are read, they become judgment. And that brings us, finally, to the fifth triad, Kara Melech Yehuda. The scroll was read, not by a priest, not by a prophet, but by the king, the covenant representative of the people. In reading the book, Josiah brings the full weight of its content upon himself and his nation. His reading is not passive, it is performative. It closes the circuit of accountability. From divine speech to divine action, from sacred place to sacred text. Everything now lands in the hands of the king, and through him, upon the people. This triad teaches us that representation matters. Authority is not a shield from consequence, it is a conduit for it. These five triads form not only a logical progression, but a theological descent. The movement is downward and inward. From the heavens, God speaks. Into time, God arrives in judgment. Onto the earth, the judgment finds its target. Through the text, the covenant book becomes the standard. Into the body of leadership, the king reads, and all are implicated. Each triad tightens the net. Each one narrows the focus until the abstract becomes painfully concrete. It is not someone, somewhere, but this God, here and now, speaking to this place, through this book, read by this king, on behalf of this people. And at the center of it all is the scroll. That fragile object buried in the temple, forgotten for a generation, now returning with divine force. It does not need to be rewritten, it needs only to be read. What we have seen is not merely a passage but a living structure, one in which theology, language, logic, and narrative are fully interwoven. The triads are not just poetic devices or linguistic formulas, they are engines of meaning. Each is necessary, and together they construct a theological architecture in which judgment is revealed as just, responsive, and total. But there is a haunting irony in all of this. The king who reads is righteous. Josiah's humility is sincere, his reforms are faithful. And yet, the reading of the scroll seals Judah's fate. Why? Because revelation demands response, not only from the king, but from the people. And that response, across generations, has already failed. This final insight draws together the whole vision that truth, once heard, cannot be unheard. Once the scroll is read, once God says Hineni, once the book is no longer hidden. Accountability is total. And so the triads show us not only the path of judgment, but the moral structure of revelation itself. May we ask then, what scrolls lie unread in our own lives? What truths have we heard, but not heeded? And when we speak, or lead, or hear sacred things, do we recognize the full weight of what has been spoken? The five triads of 2 Kings 22:16 do not merely tell us what happened. They show us how it happened, why it happened, and what it means when divine word becomes history,